Crysis, the PC slayer, the graphics card killer, the game responsible for your countless upgrades on your PC and money spent just to play a game. Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today we'll be looking at the Crysis series and if you can finally run them on ultra settings in 2019 on an entry level PC. I will also be going through each game in the series. These will be the three main games: Crysis, Crysis 2 and Crysis 3. So let's get started. So Crysis is a first-person shooter game, created and developed by Crytek and released by EA in 2007. It raised the standard for graphics in the gaming industry. It was one of the first games running on DirectX 10 API, and at the time this was quite huge, seeing as DirectX 10 released in 2006. The graphics API included volumetric lighting, lush vegetation, and was also the first game ever to include screen space ambient occlusion. Because of this, Crysis was mostly saw as a benchmark for PCs, instead of a game. And so the phrase, "but can it Crysis," was born. Basically at the time the requirements for this game was high. Quad-core processors were just releasing that year and they were quite expensive. Dual-core processors were mid-range. So seeing as you couldn't afford the high-end processors, you would still install it on your Pentium 4 single-core PC with about 512 megs of RAM and hope and pray that the game would run. You would install Crysis, wait for about an hour, as the game was almost 8 gigs, which in today's standards would be about 80 gigs. When it was finally complete, you would launch it, play it for a few minutes, maybe a few seconds. This would overheat your CPU and GPU, setting your PC on fire, which will result in your house burning down and then ultimately leaving you sleeping on the streets. So the recommended requirements for this game was an Intel Core 2 Duo at 2.0 GHz, 2 gigs of RAM and an Nvidia 7800 series graphics card, an ATI Radeon 1800 series graphics card with about 512 megabytes of graphics memory or more. And we will compare these requirements to my entry-level gaming PC. Keep in mind though, the Core i7-3770 that I have, I know it's old, but in 2019 it will be compared to a Ryzen 2400G APU or a Core i3-8100, which are both entry-level CPUs. I will also be benching all three games on ultra settings and only change the resolution for different results. Alright, so in Crysis at 1080p Full HD we have a minimum of 49 frames per second, which is a bit disappointing. I would have loved to hit that 60 FPS cap, but unfortunately we weren't able to achieve that. And then in average we have a 67, which is not bad. Then in 1440p we have a minimum of 35 frames per second and an average of 44 frames per second. And then in 4K we have a minimum of 35 frames per second again, and then an average of 43. So I think the whole wall between 1440p and 4K is obviously a bottleneck between the CPU and the GPU. The bottleneck is at the GPU, so that means that this game needs more than 4 gigabytes of VRAM to actually run properly. It could also mean that the RX 570 is just not fast enough and not capable. But overall these benchmarks were not bad. I mean, if you want to play Crysis at 30 frames per second on very high detail at 4K, everything on ultra, then that would be awesome for you. I myself am not a 30 frames per second guy, unfortunately. I've never liked the whole idea of 30 frames per second. It feels slow and laggy. But if you're able to do it, then go for it. That's awesome. So on to Crysis 2. Fast forward a few years to 2011 when EA released Crysis 2. Now after the launch of Crysis in 2007, Crysis 2 was highly anticipated and got pretty good reviews, but unfortunately those good reviews were only for the graphical side of the game. The storyline on the other hand was not rated very high though. You see, instead of doing a sandbox based game like with Crysis, Crytek opted for a more A to B storyline approach, so you have to get from point A to point B as fast as possible. And I mean, how fun does that sound? I mean, like, nyeh. The graphical side, however, was completely revamped. It ran on CryEngine 3 and supported DirectX 11 after the Ultra upgrade patch. And this meant it had features like tessellation, soft shadows, improved water rendering, and particle motion blur. Now the requirements for Crysis 2 was as followed. And then we will be testing it on our test bench, which would be our entry-level gaming PC. So let's see the benchmarks. So Crysis 2 1080p, minimum 36 frames per second, average 49 frames per second, so that's not bad, not bad. 1440p, minimum 35 frames per second and average 47. And then at 4K, minimum 18 frames per second and then average of 25 frames per second. So we're not even hitting console grade there. It's not even console grade like optimization, graphics, playability of the game, the gameplay, like it's non-existent. Yeah, I have to say it was really crappy at 4K. I tried playing it, I can't play it. It was irritating and I just switched off the game at that point. So there you have it, folks. Crysis 2 on an entry-level PC in 2019. So let's get on to Crysis 3. This brings us to the last and final installment in the series. Crysis 3 was released in 2013 and would be dubbed the best looking shooter ever. Now Crysis 3 wasn't running on CryEngine 4. Instead, Crytek just updated the graphics engine, which had increased and improved shadows, glossy reflections, better textures, better shading, and a couple of other settings as well. And honestly, the game looked breathtaking, and to this day there are still PCs that cannot run this game at a stable frame rate. However, I do suggest you go and check out a few videos online where a couple of people have maxed out the game on 2080 Ti's, which just shows how demanding and beautiful this game is, even in 2019. I will leave links of the videos in the description down below. And while there isn't really much to say on this game, other than the fact that it looks stunning and is still very demanding. So let's just get through the benchmarks. So the requirements for Crysis 3 were as follow. I should also include that these requirements were for full settings at 30 frames per second, which meant you needed a lot better hardware to get the game to 60 frames per second stable. And looking at recommended requirements, would more and faster RAM, a 4-core 8-threaded CPU and 4GB GPU be enough to get the game to run at 1080p with 60 frames per second stable? And apparently not. In 1080p, with FXAA applied, we had a minimum of 44 frames per second and an average of 59. On 1440p we had a minimum of 35 frames per second and an average of 41 frames per second. And at 4K, a minimum of 17 frames per second and an average of 19 frames per second. Then, with all the settings maxed with 8 times MSAA, we've got a minimum at 1080p of 21 frames per second and an average of 33 frames per second. Then at 1440p we have a minimum of 14 frames per second and an average of 20 frames per second. And then at 4K we have a minimum of 0 frames per second and an average of only 5 frames per second. So the question was, can you run the Crysis series on an entry-level gaming PC in 2019 at max settings? And the answer is yes and no. Yes, you will be able to run it, but only at 30 frames per second, which means this would be console grade. As a quick side note, do not go looking for Crysis 4, as it doesn't exist. Although on the 1st of April in 2019, an article appeared on the website called Dark Side of Gaming that claims that Crysis 4 was in the works and would be launched in 2020. It further goes on to state that they found leaked screenshots to the game and you could find it here. But if you were to click on the here highlighted text, you would just be rigmarolled. And of course, this was all an April Fool's joke, as it was on the 1st of April. Also, I would just like to add in there that I will be using Crysis 3 as a benchmark tool from now on in all my videos, seeing as this game really is really taxing on hardware, and I think it's just shown that it's got a lot more to give in terms of performance, and that it still hasn't died yet, and it's aged very well. So guys, hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked this video, as always, please like and subscribe, and stay awesome.